All right, so we're diving deep today into Malaysian schools.
Oh, interesting.
But not just like the usual stuff about classrooms and tests and stuff.
Oh,
You sent over some readings from your educational leadership course.
yeah.
And one PDF especially caught my eye. It was titled Topic 7 HMEF5023 2.pdf.
Sounds pretty academic.
It is, but it's also surprisingly juicy.
Juicy. How so?
Well, it's all about organizational politics in Malaysian schools.
Oh, wow, I see what you mean.
Yeah, like I had no idea how much maneuvering and strategizing goes on behind the scenes.
Yeah, we talk a lot about these theories in organizational behavior, but it's fascinating to see how they actually play out in the real world.
Right, it's like we have this image of school being this pure place of learning,
Exactly.
but in reality, it's just as complex and political as any other organization.
Absolutely. Schools are like mini societies with their own intricate webs of relationships and power dynamics.
It's so true. And this deep dive is really revealing that, like, even down to who gets the best classroom supplies. There's a whole lot of maneuvering for resources and status and influence.
And the source material we're looking at really emphasizes the hierarchical structure of Malaysian schools.
Right, it's like this top-down system.
Yeah, it starts with the Ministry of Education calling the shots.
And then it trickles down to state and district officers.
Then inspectors, then principals.
And finally, the teachers on the ground.
So even in public schools, you might not expect a ton of political maneuvering.
Right, because they're all funded by the government, right?
Yeah, but even then, decisions about things like funding and curriculum
Even promotions.
can become surprisingly political.
Did you ever experience anything like that?
Oh, absolutely, all the time. I remember one instance where, well, let's just say the allocation of new computers.
Oh, tell me more.
Let's just say it wasn't exactly based on which classrooms needed them most.
I bet it was more about who had the principal's ear.
Exactly.
It's like high school all over again.
Pretty much. And then on top of that, you've got private schools.
Which are a whole other ballgame.
Right. They rely heavily on things like philanthropists and student fees.
So it's like they're constantly campaigning for public approval.
Yeah, they have to secure enrollment to keep the lights on.
The source material even uses this phrase, gain the confidence of the public, when describing private schools.
I noticed that too.
It's so revealing.
It implies this whole layer of strategy and image building that we don't always associate with education.
It makes you wonder how much of what happens in schools is really driven by genuine educational goals.
Versus these political strategies to get ahead.
Right. It's a little unsettling when you think about it.
Yeah, and that brings us to the human side of things.
The teachers and administrators who are actually navigating this complex landscape.
This is where it gets really interesting. The source material mentions Theory X and Theory Y approaches to management.
Those sound familiar. Can you refresh my memory?
Of course. So a Theory X leader would be someone who micromanages everything.
Like they don't trust anyone to do their job right.
Exactly. They believe that teachers need strict supervision, and they really emphasize control.
Okay, and then Theory Y is the opposite.
Right. A Theory Y leader would give teachers more autonomy, encourage collaboration.
And trust them to take ownership of their classrooms.
Exactly.
So which style is more effective?
Well, the ideal scenario is finding a balance.
That makes sense. You need some structure and accountability.
But you also want to foster a culture of trust and creativity.
Right. But finding that balance can be tricky.
Especially when you factor in the cultural context.
Okay, so let's talk about culture. The source mentions how shared values and beliefs,
Even things like rituals and unspoken rules.
all of that really shapes the way people behave in schools.
It's not just about official policies. It's about this whole unwritten code of conduct.
And that can have a huge impact on everything from classroom management to teacher morale.
Absolutely. For example, in many Malaysian schools, there's this deep respect for authority and seniority.
That's interesting.
It can really influence how decisions are made and how feedback is given and received.
Right. It's not always explicitly stated, but it's definitely there shaping the dynamics. It's like this hidden language that everyone understands.
But newcomers might miss.
Exactly.
Even how student success is measured can be influenced by cultural norms.
So it's not always purely objective.
Right. The source argues that performance assessments often rely on these shared meanings and interpretations.
So even something as seemingly straightforward as a test score can be wrapped up in these cultural assumptions and political undercurrents.
It's all connected.
Wow, this is getting really deep. And we can't forget about the role of the Malaysian government in shaping the school landscape.
Absolutely. The government has a huge influence.
The source talks about 3 orientations of government: inner, exterior, and mediating force.
Yeah, those are important concepts.
I have to admit, I got a little lost in the definitions. Can you break those down for me?
Sure. So think of the inner orientation as like the behind-the-scenes bureaucracy.
So like the people at the Ministry of Education.
Exactly.
Mm.
They manage budgets, oversee programs, create regulations.
They're like the gears keeping the whole system running.
Right. But then you have this exterior force.
Which sounds a lot more active.
It is. The exterior orientation is all about the political pressure coming from outside the ministry.
Okay, so like teacher unions, parent associations.
Even political parties.
All vying for influence.
And trying to sway policy decisions in their favor.
So that's where we see those campaigns for education reform.
Or debates about funding priorities.
Exactly. It's like this constant push and pull.
Between what's best for students, what's politically expedient.
And what's actually feasible within the system.
And then you have this mediating force which tries to balance it all out.
Right. It's a delicate balancing act for sure.
And one of the most powerful tools the government has to shape the education landscape is regulations.
People often see regulations as just bureaucratic hurdles.
But the source makes a really interesting point about how they can be strategic levers for change.
Especially when new regulations are tied to funding for specific initiatives. Exactly. The source mentions vocational schools, residential schools, special education.
All areas that have benefited from this approach.
It's a way to incentivize schools to adopt new practices and prioritize certain programs.
It's like the government is saying, here's a new direction we want to go in, and here are the resources to make it happen.
Exactly. Okay, so we've got this complex system of structures and policies and political maneuvering.
It's a lot to unpack.
But how do we know if it's actually working? How do we measure success?
Well, the traditional approach to accountability in education focuses on inputs, processes, and results.
So, like, did the school receive adequate funding?
Was the curriculum delivered effectively?
Did students achieve the desired learning outcomes?
Right. It's a very linear cause and effect model.
But the source challenges this simplistic view.
Arguing that it fails to capture the complexity of organizational politics.
And all the nuances that influence school performance.
Exactly. It's not as simple as saying, we gave the school X amount of money, so they should have produced Y results.
Right. There are so many other factors at play.
Leadership styles, cultural norms, resource allocation, community involvement.
It's not a simple equation.
And that leads to a more nuanced discussion of how we measure success.
Because a test score only tells part of the story.
Exactly. And this brings us to a really interesting concept introduced in the source, Machiavellian tendencies.
Ah, well, that sounds a little ominous.
Well, it's not about encouraging cutthroat behavior or anything.
Okay, good.
But the source highlights that sometimes individuals within a school might prioritize their own goals or agendas.
Over the collective good.
Right. And this can manifest in really subtle ways.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. So maybe a teacher who plays favorites to gain popularity with certain students.
Or an administrator who manipulates data to make their department look better.
Those are perfect examples. And the source argues that these tendencies can have real implications for the school environment.
Like leading to unfair treatment or stifled creativity.
Even the suppression of dissenting voices.
It's like a shadow side of organizational politics that we need to be aware of.
So we can mitigate its negative effects.
Exactly. And speaking of navigating the complexities of school life, the source also dives into the topic of disagreement and conflict.
Which is something we all have to deal with at some point.
I remember dreading conflict back when I was in school.
Me too. It felt like this big, scary thing that had to be avoided at all costs.
But the source reminds us that disagreement is simply a difference of opinion.
And those differences can actually be valuable if we handle them constructively.
So it's conflict that we really need to manage carefully.
Exactly. When disagreements escalate into something more adversarial.
That's when it becomes a problem.
Right. So it's not about pretending that conflict doesn't exist.
But rather developing the skills and strategies to navigate it effectively.
The source even asks you, the listener, to think back to a time when you experienced a serious disagreement at school or work.
That's a good exercise.
How did you respond? What were the outcomes?
It's like an invitation to reflect on our own experiences.
And how we handle those inevitable moments of tension.
Because understanding our own tendencies in conflict situations is the first step to becoming more effective communicators.
And problem solvers.
I like that. And the source walks us through several different approaches to dealing with disagreement.
Some common, some less so.
All right, let's dive into those strategies. I'm curious to see what the source recommends.
So, like, we've all seen that classic power struggle play out, right?
Yeah, totally.
Like that I win, you lose scenario.
Where each side just digs in their heels and refuses to budge.
Exactly. It's
Okay.
like they're both trying to win a tug of war.
It can get pretty intense. especially when there's something important at stake.
Like limited resources or a coveted promotion.
Oh, for sure. I remember one time when two teachers were practically at each other's throats.
Oh, no. What happened?
They were fighting over the limited budget for classroom supplies.
Oh, wow. That's rough. And while that approach might lead to a resolution of sorts.
Like someone eventually wins the tug of war.
Right. But it often breeds resentment and can damage relationships in the long run.
It's like winning the battle but losing the war.
Exactly. Then you have the compromise route.
Where everyone gives up a little something to reach an agreement.
Right. It's like splitting the difference.
So no one's really happy, but at least there's a decision.
Compromise can be effective in certain situations.
Like when time is of the essence.
But it can also leave everyone feeling a bit dissatisfied.
So like they didn't fully get what they wanted.
And then there's the avoidance strategy.
Oh yeah, where people just try to sidestep the conflict altogether.
Sweep it under the rug.
I have to admit, I've been guilty of that one myself.
We've all been there. It might seem like the path of least resistance.
In the moment.
Right. But it rarely solves the underlying issues.
And it can lead to all these simmering tensions that eventually erupt.
Exactly. It's like a ticking time bomb. So those common approaches have their downsides.
For sure. So what does the source recommend instead?
It emphasizes the importance of open communication, active listening, and finding solutions that address the needs of all parties involved.
So it's about shifting away from that adversarial me versus you mentality.
Right, and trying to find common ground.
The source actually uses the term synergistic approach.
Suggesting that collaboration can lead to more creative and effective solutions.
Than any one person could come up with on their own.
Exactly. It's about leveraging the collective wisdom of the group.
I can see how that would be especially important in a school setting.
Where everyone is ultimately working towards the same goal.
The success of the students.
Right. And it's about separating the people from the problem.
So instead of seeing the other person as the enemy,
focus on the issue at hand and try to understand their perspective.
It's like depersonalizing the conflict.
Which is easier said than done sometimes, especially when emotions are running high.
For sure.
The source acknowledges that it takes effort and practice to maintain an objective stance during disagreements.
But managing our own emotional responses is crucial.
For having a constructive dialogue.
I'm starting to see how this deep dive isn't just about understanding organizational politics
in Malaysian schools,
but also about equipping ourselves with the tools to navigate these dynamics effectively.
Exactly. It's about becoming more skillful communicators and problem solvers.
And to debunk a few common misconceptions.
The source highlights some myths about disagreement.
That often hold people back from having these important conversations.
Right.
Oh yeah, those were great. I especially appreciated the point about disagreement and conflict not being the same thing.
That's a really important distinction.
It's so easy to conflate the two.
Yeah, people often use those terms interchangeably.
But disagreement is just a difference of opinion.
Which can actually be quite healthy and productive.
It can lead to new ideas and perspectives.
Exactly. It's when those differences escalate into something more adversarial.
That we're talking about conflict.
Right.
And as the source points out, conflict is a natural part of human interaction.
Not something to be feared or avoided at all costs.
Exactly. It's about learning to manage it effectively.
So it doesn't derail the school's mission or create a toxic environment.
The source also tackles the myth that conflict always stems from personality clashes.
Like it's always a matter of someone being difficult or stubborn.
Right. But sometimes it's about understanding the underlying issues.
Or the competing priorities.
That are actually driving the disagreement.
Like disagreements over resource allocation.
Or the best way to implement a new initiative.
It's not always personal.
And sometimes it's about a difference in values.
Their individuals have fundamentally different beliefs about what's best for the school or its students.
And in those cases, open and respectful dialogue is even more important.
Even if you don't ultimately agree with the other person's viewpoint.
You know, as we've been talking, I've been reflecting on my own experiences in school.
It's amazing how this topic can bring up so many memories.
I realize now that a lot of the things I chalked up to personality clashes
were probably rooted in these deeper organizational and cultural dynamics.
It's like I was just seeing the tip of the iceberg.
And now you're starting to see the whole picture.
It's like this whole new lens for understanding the world around us.
Exactly.
And it's not just limited to schools.
Right. These dynamics play out in all sorts of organizations.
Even our own workplaces.
It's about recognizing those patterns, understanding the motivations and pressures driving them.
And then finding ways to channel those forces towards positive outcomes.
Exactly.
Because at the end of the day, we're all invested in the success of our schools and our students.
And sometimes that means engaging with the political realities.
Not just shying away from them.
I think this deep dive has provided us with valuable insights.
And a framework for thinking about these issues in a more nuanced and productive way.
I agree.
Yeah.
Hopefully it sparks some new ideas and questions for our listener as well.
Maybe they're thinking about their own experiences in school.
And how organizational politics might have shaped their own educational journey.
Or maybe they're inspired to get involved in advocating for positive change.
Within their own school communities.
Whatever takeaways they've gleaned.
I hope this deep dive has empowered them to view the world of education.
With a more critical and insightful lens.
Absolutely.
Well said. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of organizational politics in Malaysian schools, what's the one big takeaway you want listeners to walk away with?
I think for me, it's that organizational politics aren't inherently good or bad.
Yeah, it's not so black and white.
It's more about understanding how these dynamics play out and then using that knowledge to make things better.
To create a better learning environment for everyone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The source really encourages us to move beyond those simplistic labels.
The good guys and bad guys.
Right, and to really grapple with the complexities of these systems.
And to remember that schools are like little microcosms of society.
Reflecting all the same political and cultural dynamics that we see in the larger world.
So it's not just about what's happening inside the school walls.
It's about understanding the bigger picture.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing those patterns.
And understanding the motivations and pressures behind them.
And then finding ways to channel all of that towards positive outcomes.
Because ultimately, we all want the same thing.
We want our schools and our students to succeed.
And sometimes that means getting a little bit political.
Not being afraid to engage with those realities.
This deep dive has given us a lot to think about.
A whole new framework for understanding how things work.
And hopefully it sparks some new ideas for our listeners too.
Maybe they're thinking about their own experiences.
And how organizational politics might have shaped their own education.
Maybe they're even inspired to get involved and advocate for change.
In their own community.
Whatever they take away from this.
I hope it empowers them to see the world of education with fresh eyes.
To be more critical and insightful.
Exactly.
Well said. So on that note, a huge thank you to you for guiding us through this deep dive.
It's been my pleasure.
It's been a real eye-opener.
I always enjoy these conversations.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on the deep dive. We'll see you next time for another adventure in knowledge.